All right, folks, let's take a look at section 3 of chapter 15. Here is our focus question. The Reconstruction Act sparked great political activity among formerly enslaved people in the South who held mass meetings, went on strike, and tried to desegregate public transportation. Thousands of Southern blacks joined the Union League, an organization tied to the Republican Party, and the vast majority of eligible black voters registered to vote. In the words of one formerly enslaved person turned political leader, blacks had heard the tocsin of freedom. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and most were under Republican control. Their new state constitutions, drafted in 1868 and 69 in conventions with substantial black representation, were an improvement over the old state constitutions. They created state funded systems of free public education, penitentiaries, and orphan and insane asylums where none existed before. They guaranteed equality of civil and political rights and abolished antebellum practices such as whipping as a criminal punishment, property qualifications for office holding, and imprisonment for debt. Though blacks were the majority of Republican voters, white Republicans controlled the state Republican parties and held most political offices. Only South Carolina, with a high percentage of blacks in the population, had a majority black legislature. But the 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift in power in the South. 2 blacks were elected to the U.S. Senate, 14 were elected to the U.S. House, and 1 served as the first black governor in Louisiana. Many blacks served in state legislatures, and more blacks than ever before held lower offices such as sheriff, tax assessor, and policeman. Most were formerly enslaved. The South's new state governments also empowered new groups of whites. Some were Northerners who migrated to the South after the war. Opponents called them carpetbaggers, implying they packed their possessions in a suitcase to quickly move to the South and gain the spoils of office. Although a few were corrupt, most carpetbaggers were Union Army veterans who decided to stay in the South after the war. Others were investors in land and railroads seeking economic opportunity. Yet others were teachers, Freedmen Bureau's officers, or others who traveled to the South to help formerly enslaved people. Most white Republicans, however, were from the South and were despised by former Confederates, who saw them as treasonous scalawags. Although a few were wealthy whites, most were white, non-slaveholding, small farmers from the southern upcountry. Many had been Unionists during the war or hoped Reconstruction governments would pass laws favoring indebted farmers. The Reconstruction government's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both black and white children, although usually in segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states also strengthened the economic power of rural blacks by passing laws favoring agricultural workers and sharecroppers. Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution, as many blacks had once hoped, but rather tried by developing railroads, which they hoped would spur industrialization, urbanization, and diversified agriculture. Every southern state tried to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies, but a revitalized southern economy failed to take shape. Nevertheless, radical Reconstruction transformed the South by empowering poor whites, northern migrants, and formerly enslaved people. It is a measure of how far change had progressed that the reaction against Reconstruction proved so extreme. So, that was our third section. We'll be back for the fourth one next.